So it attracted great interest, but it's human identity in the age of AI. I'm so glad that it appealed to you. But the moderator for tonight is Professor Rebecca Willett. She's the War of Family Professor in the Wallman Society of Fellows of Statistics and Computer Science and the Director of AI in the Data Science Institute at the university. I'm going to tell you just a couple sentences about them because it's both impressive and I think it'll help you frame and contextualize the conversation. Dr. Willett's research is focused on machine learning foundations, scientific machine learning, and signal processing. She's also the Deputy Director for Research at the NSF Simmons Foundation National Institute for Theory and Mathematics in Biology, Deputy Director for Research at the NSF's Simons Institute for AI in the Sky, and a member of the NSF Institute for the Foundation of Data Science Executive Committee. She also teaches, conducts this research, and is on numerous university-wide committees. Thank you for being with us tonight. Joining Professor Willett for our discussion, first is Chris Kennedy. Professor Kennedy is the William H. Colvin Professor of Linguistics. You have to applaud. His work is geared toward discovering and describing the principles that are involved in relating linguistics forms to meanings, determining how this mapping is achieved through the interaction of properties of the linguistic system, properties of cognition more generally, and broader features of communicative context, and understanding the extent to which structural and typological feature of language can be explained in terms of meaning. Our third faculty joining us is Sharese King. Dr. King is the Neubauer Family Assistant Professor of Linguistics. Her research draws on phonetic, ethnographic, and experimental techniques to explore how African American speech is constructed and racialized, and the implications for racialized voices within the judicial system in the United States. Her work on how language models perpetuate systems, systemic racial prejudices, was recently published in Nature. And our final speaker is Professor Heather Zheng. Dr. Zheng is a Neubauer Professor of Computer Science. Her most recent research focuses on copyright protection and fake content detection with regard to AI systems, the security and privacy of deep learning systems, and mobility, Internet of Things, and virtual reality, that's VR, right? And virtual reality sensing and its implications for security and privacy. She's the co-director of the university's Security, Algorithms, Networking, and Data Lab. I am so excited just reading their bio. I think you're in for a treat. I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Willett. Thank you.
Thank you, Armin. I'm also delighted to be here. I'm really excited about the topic tonight. So just to warm us up, I was hoping that each of you could say a little bit more about yourselves beyond what Armin said. And in particular, something about how your research is influenced by or intersecting with AI. So Chris, do you want to kick us off?
Sure. As Armin said, I study meaning in language. It's you can kind of divide that up into two parts. One is how does meaning come in virtue of the computational system that humans are probably running in some ways that's letting us use language in ways that other species don't. On the other hand is how much of it comes from the fact that we're smart social primates that recognize that we're using a system like that and can kind of do a bunch of inferencing based on that. So the AI connection is basically our language models are doing that too. And how can we use language models to better understand whatever it is that we're doing?
Great. Sharese.
Yeah, thank you. Also, thank you all for coming out today. It's really a pleasure to be here. I am a sociolinguist, and so I'm interested in this relationship between language and society. I study it through the lens of race, and particularly with respect to AI, I'm interested in these questions of how our usage of these language models can perpetuate bias against speech from African Americans, and what are the social consequences for how African Americans or other minoritized populations can participate in the society, given some of the harms that AI algorithms can generate.
Excellent. And Heather?
So thanks for coming. I'm a computer scientist. I study security and privacy in many different contexts. So recently I look at how AI models, how we protect them from misuse, and how they can be misused, or how do we protect the human creatives who are affected by the generative AI, and how do we help them to deal with the unethical use of their data. So we're looking at how do we actually build usable tools that as an end user ourselves can fight back against the unethical use of technology.
Great. And then Heather, maybe we should just clarify that, we've talked so far about generative AI, large language models, or tools for generating images, but that's not the only type of AI out there, right?
Right. So over my career, I see many different types of AI models. We're starting from the traditional or the classical AI we call predictive AI. They're trying to understand what's the input as well. For example, in object detection, you're trying to understand if a camera take an image, what the person in front of the image, who that is, or what kind of object. Is that a round object, or is that a rectangular object? We call these predictive AI. There's different type of new hype is in generative AI. It's more about how do I actually reproduce or generate certain part of like images, sound, voice, and even 3D environment. So there are two different types of AI we're looking at today.
Super. Okay, so that's it for the easy questions. So there's this recent research paper coming out of Microsoft where they were looking at GPT-4. And they wrote, the title of this paper was Sparks of Artificial General Intelligence. And they wrote, we demonstrate that beyond its mastery of language, GPT-4 can solve difficult tasks that span mathematics, coding, vision, medicine, law, psychology, and more, without needing any special prompting. Moreover, in all of these tasks, GPT-4's performance is strikingly close to human-level performance. We believe that it could be reasonably viewed as an early, yet still incomplete version of artificial general intelligence systems. So this paper generated a lot of discussion among many different communities about the nature of artificial general intelligence, the nature of human cognition and human capabilities, and how they differ from those of modern AI systems. And so, Chris, I know that you, in your work, have identified several sort of core foundational aspects of humanness, things like our values or justice, culture, identity, morality. And I wonder if you could comment on how we should think about those things when we're thinking about AI systems and their capability for intelligence or human-like behavior.
Sure, I think that the quote from the Microsoft article is interesting because the kind of key term in there is performance, and where the sort of reactions are based on observations of the performance of these systems, and performance is a kind of behavior. And kind of as long as people have been thinking seriously about what the capacities of computational systems could be, I guess since Alan Turing's computing machine and intelligence article in the 50s, or the famous origin of the Turing test or the imitation game, the idea about what you would need to look at to make assessments about what artificial systems are doing is that you look at behavior and what they do, basically what they perform when you compare that to what humans are doing. And there's something very generous about that idea, which is it doesn't presuppose or rule out any kind of thing doing the kinds of things that we think we do. And that's I think, appropriate. It's also scientifically a nice sort of conservative measure. We know how to compare things and quantify them and ask whether something is doing the same thing as something else in terms of the behavior it's producing. But it's also really limiting. And anybody knows, say, the history of psychology will know that, behaviorist approaches to psychology, which limited, decisions or hypotheses we could make about people to observations of behavior sort of crashed and burned in the 50s, 60s, as people realized that it didn't have the full capacity to explain the richness of human mental life, at least, and language played a big role in that. So how do we think about these things? How do we address this question? Are these artificial systems doing what humans are doing? Well, the other thing we need to do is learn from and talk to people who've been thinking hard about what it is to do the kinds of things that humans do. What is it to use, to speak a language, to speak in a meaningful way, to communicate? What is it to create cultural productions, and what do those cultural productions mean? These are the kinds of questions that people in fields like linguistics and history, and all of our colleagues in literary scholarship fields, in the arts, in art history, they've been thinking about these questions in philosophy for a very long time, and have developed answers by looking at humans to questions like, what is meaning? What is it? What is involved in using and producing language in a way that involves a notion of meaning? So that's the thing that's closest to my mind. What is the significance of our creative works, and what do they tell us about who we are and our history and so forth? So I think the way to get at these questions is to focus on these different dimensions of human, cultural, and creative production, and also ask, what do the experts who understand and thought about those things the hardest over the years have to say about what they are, and bring those conversations together, the people who really understand well how to think about performance and measurement of behavior, because it's going to be some synthesis of asking and answering those two kinds of questions that I think is going to give us traction on the kinds of issues that the people at Microsoft and all of us should be thinking about.
That's fascinating. And I think, it's fundamentally interesting just to think about like the nature of language as you articulated. But in addition, I think it's interesting to think about, well, what are the ramifications of these definitions and these boundaries when we start thinking about using these things as tools in high stakes decision-making processes. And so, Sharese, I think this is something that you've studied quite a bit.
Yeah, I'll talk a little bit about the positives first of what it can do, right? I can talk about the bias at it. But I think one of the great things that, at least as a researcher, we can get from this kind of method of analysis is that we can use lots of more data than we would traditionally be able to do. One example I'll give you is that for me as a sociolinguist, I interview people usually about an hour to an hour and a half about their life. And we look at the content of the interviews as well as the forms. But for every hour of speech, it takes about 7 to 9 hours for a human to transcribe, right? And so new technology has emerged now that has allowed it such that we can plug it into our transcription software, and within 15 minutes, you can have a transcript for what would take us a lot longer, right? And so there's a sense of efficiency that people feel, right? And productivity that can come along with this kind of technology. So you also have things like people being able to create lesson plans, for students, maybe them being able to create an outline for their essay, right? There are different ways in which we can use this to help us. But on the flip side of it, right, I think the piece you say about decision making becomes really important for us to grapple with. What are the consequences of interacting with this technology for particular populations, right? That it is not necessarily always inherently good because it makes some things easier for people, right? And so some examples that have come up in my own research is I'm interested in meaning, but from the perspective of social meaning. So how is it that when you listen to speech or read speech, you can make assumptions about who the person is, right? Their age, their gender, their race. How are we doing that? What cues are we using to do that? And so in the context of looking at bias in AI, we were curious, a team that consisted of myself and people from Stanford University. We were really curious about how is it that the decisions people make using this AI technology exemplify social meanings associated with African Americans, for example. But we also looked at other dialects like Southern speech, Lumbee English, which is a kind of indigenous language, and things like that. And the results were really scary. We actually found that the associations, when we gave it tweets in both African American English as well as, and these were written, as well as mainstream American English, we found that the kinds of qualities associated with the African American tweets were more negative than the worst reported for a human subject in the Princeton Trilogy study, right? And so that's one thing that came up. We found that they tend to be associated with less prestigious jobs. And even when we gave it sort of this decision of sort of convictions or death sentences, they were higher for the tweets that were typed in African American English than, say, a mainstream kind of dialect. So those are the kinds of consequences that we're dealing with regarding decision making. Yeah.
Oh, that's excellent. So now, Chris and Sharese, you guys have both been talking predominantly about language, but Heather, I think you deal a little bit more with images and visual arts, is that right?
Yeah, in the past 2 years, we have been, as a research team, we have been dealing with interacting with a lot of visual artists to look at how Gen AI has actually affecting their lives, their jobs. So a lot of times people think that, like Sharese says that it's efficiency. So artists can actually have been using these digital tools, which could be created by AI, right? But a lot of times you think about, does that replace human creativity? It does not. Because for artists, these are APIs. APIs are limited. They can only define some part of the process. A lot of times these processes, our statistical process, cannot be repeated. For artists, they need to actually, when they use it, they need to understand, because when they create arts, it comes with intention, it comes with some message, it comes with their emotion, their lifetime experience. A lot of times this cannot be reflected by the AI tools. So we have been working on how can we help artists to minimize or fight back against the Gen AI effect on them. A lot of time when we think about, from the artistic creation point of view, AI tools can be their help. But on the other hand, a lot of time AI tools are being used to replace them, because whoever make these decisions are the executives, are the production managers who cares about efficiency more than the creativity, right? But a lot of time we see a lot of examples, including the recent Coca-Cola commercial, that folks, the customers who are viewing these commercials are feeling very negative effect of these artificially created content. Especially in the Coke commercial, there are 6 fingers from the artist that toast up the fries, right? So does this reflect that AI can be a tool, but it cannot replace creativity? A lot of times when we create these human arts, visual arts, or music, there is a specific meaning towards that. And humans are the master of these meanings. And the training of the human artist is important there. So from our research perspective, we have been working on how do we help human artists. So from a computer scientist, the source of all these models coming from the user data. A lot of time artists, they have to put their artwork online, because this work, they get publicity, they get commission, they get work, they get paid. So, but their data being actually ethically used by the companies without the models, without being paid or come. So we have been designing tools so that when artists put their artwork online, they can still do that, but we add a protection, kind of a perturbation, so that the company will make very, very hard for the company to act, or the individual AI enthusiastic to leverage this data to recreating these arts on their behalf. So I think there is a way for technology to help human creatives, and there should be some kind of balance to achieve within this interaction.
Yeah, Heather, I know this tool that you guys released has gotten a lot of attention from the artistic community, and because people are very concerned, as you said. And my understanding is that, the fact that you understand the technology is what enabled you to develop these tools that are being used in widely different circumstances.
Yeah, I think it's a lot of time, we learned a lot in the past 2 years that as technologists, we need to talk to the artists. Like Chris says, we have to bring everybody into the community to understand. We learn a lot from artists. What do they need? What kind of a usable tool for them so that they can go on with their life? As always, true, artists normally don't have very heavy computation equipment, right? So you cannot just give them a tool, ask them to use the A100, whatever GPU to create these ones. So it is important for technologists to understand what is a usable tool that human creative can leverage to protect their data and protect their work. And ultimately, our goal is trying to say the way that if you do not respect the artist or human individual's data, the cost of training on these data is going to be significant. Reach to the balance that it's actually cheaper, more economic to actually buy the data or license the data from the artist or from human creative rather than training without their consent.
So I think this is one really nice example of how UChicago Scholarship is helping us, mitigate some of the risks associated with AI, and at the same time, allowing people to benefit from it when appropriate. So Sharese, I think you might also have some examples of UChicago Scholarship in this space.
Yeah, so relative to, I think, this cross-collaboration, UChicago is a wonderful space to do multidisciplinary work, right? And so even though, for example, I am a humanist, right, in the humanities, I feel as if my work is able to speak with folks in social sciences, right, folks in healthcare industries. And so I think it's wonderful when we can have that sort of cross-pollination across these different fields. And I find myself interacting and speaking with people from the law school, right? People from economics about some of the different work that I'm doing relative to just linguistic bias more generally. And so I think that definitely it's a space for more generation and at UChicago for sure.
And then Chris, you had some really interesting thoughts on using some of these AI tools to help probe our understanding of what humanity is and some of the questions you were posing earlier. Is that right?
Right, and again, that to echo the last points, to do that properly, we need collaborations between people who've been thinking about the sort of humanistic questions and people who have, if we want to use these tools, people who really understand the tools, how to develop them, how to train them, how to test them, how to come up with evaluation techniques. So I give a couple examples. One example is not totally UChicago, but involves a connection with people at Toyota Technical Institute in Connected, which is, I guess, we're collaborators with them too. One of the things, so here's one low-level kind of creativity. How do we come to have language in the first place? How do we get from the noise that we're hearing in the world as children to having the capacity to basically say whatever we want to say in the language that's the language we hear as we're growing up? Linguists have had lots of ideas about how that works, how much we sort of maybe need to know in advance or not. This is a central debate in developmental psychology in general and in language learning in particular. One of the things you'd love to be able to do to test hypotheses about how much children may or may not need to know or have access to when they're learning language would be to not give them language. That would be bad. That would be unethical, wrong, bad in many, many ways. But this is the kind of thing that one can do with a machine who's learning. You can sort of set it up in a way that at least reflects some hypotheses about what you think the initial state of a human learner might be, and then give it all the data that humans get, subparts of the data, and look at particular kinds of things that it does and doesn't learn. To do that properly, you need to have a really good understanding of what it is that humans are paying attention to and attending to, which is understanding about human language and its complexity. You need to have a really good understanding generally about the developmental path of children. So that means working with developmental psychologists and related people. And you need to have a really good understanding of these models and how you can change their parameters, their training data, and so forth to be able to construct the kinds of experiments that you want to construct. And all of those people need to be talking to each other to address questions like this.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think that's something that's really distinctive about UChicago. I don't see that in some of our peers when I go visit them. This interaction across vastly different fields is something that I've particularly enjoyed about being a faculty member at UChicago. So one thing that I think has come up in a couple of different responses so far is law. What are the legal requirements associated with AI, with its deployment, with the way that it's trained? What are the existing regulations versus the coming regulations? And I wonder what thoughts you guys have about that. And so Heather, you think you mentioned it first. Do you want to comment?
Yeah, I think from a technical perspective, defining AI Act law is actually pretty difficult because a lot of time it's very hard to understand what is impossible and what is possible. I can give you some examples. There are some good examples. For example, California just passed the AI law where they kind of prevent deepfake images being distributed in a sexually images being distributed or actually made by generated AI. So these are very clear terms that you can define. But in many other terms, for example, copyright, it's actually pretty hard to actually define them or to quantify them. For example, if the lawmaker wanted to define the law and just ask in the query, how much of the specific training data contributed to this query result, it's actually pretty difficult to quantify that clearly. So there's a lot of challenges actually making these laws, and it's important for technologists to actually work with a lawmaker or even becoming lawmaker to be able to clearly define the AI law in the near future. Okay, so I think that's from the technology point of view is that. And the other things, I know that Gen AI, they will actually make mistakes. When they actually produce document, they will, or any content, they will make mistakes. And human needs to judge that mistakes, right? So, but a lot of time, if you don't have the skill to judge that, how do you actually do that from the beginning? So I think from a law perspective, I only heard that there's a lawyer who used that being disbarred. And there are serious discussion about from these court, how do I punish them? What's the right way to punish them? So that's a very concrete example, but how do you do that technically is also important.
You know, perhaps the fact that these systems don't know that you can't practice law without a license is a sign that they aren't quite a human level intelligence. But I think this is a great point about the technology.
I don't humans know that either.
Well, fair. But you know, Heather and I have a colleague in computer science who's an expert in privacy, and he was able to show that some of the common standards for privacy in GDPR in Europe or HIPAA in the United States, you can satisfy those laws and still not actually protect people's privacy. Those things are easily broken. And so I think, you know, it is important to involve people who understand the technology in those discussions and in the development of those laws and policies. Otherwise, they're vacuous, and we have maybe a false sense of security. So, Sharese, I know you've also thought quite a bit about law in the context of AI.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I'm so glad that this question came up because I want to build on your answer with respect to thinking about it in terms of how lawyers deploy the technology. So I recently attended and spoke at the Illinois Public Defender Conference, and I was watching a talk about how people were using sort of this kind of technology to generate like initial briefs, right, as a way of idea generation. But one of the issues is that for people who have not verified the facts of what were generated is that they actually generated fake cases that didn't exist, right? And so this is like an explicit example of just because, you know, you get a response, it doesn't mean that it's correct, right? We have to verify a lot of what we're asking of the technology. So that's one example of such. But I am also curious about, just in the language and law space, how to work with lawyers to develop tools that are helpful for them regarding other kinds of research questions I have. So in particular, I've been consulting on cases, capital cases in the state of California. And with the recent passing of the Racial Justice Act, which basically in so many words says that you can't have patterns of bias throughout the trial, right? All the way from like police interviews through the sentencing, right? And so people are like, but how do we define race? How do we look for examples of such, right? Especially if it's covert. How do we develop the tools to do that? And so I'm working with lawyers and actual natural language processing scientists to think about how to develop those tools. And so these things can be helpful and useful, it just can't be the ending point, right? I think it could help with starting to ask some of these questions, but it can't be where people finish their analyses.
Yeah, I think that's super interesting. And I think, you know, when I've talked with people at some of the major tech companies developing some of these models, and I think they are cognizant of there being some biases, and they are trying to develop tests to probe certain known biases. Say, you know, is it biased against Black people relative to white people? But then I think an additional concern that I have is it's not even clear what other biases might exist that we aren't even knowing to test for, right? Like maybe they're biased against people named Rebecca who grew up in small towns in Illinois. I would be very concerned about that. And I think that's an additional challenge that goes beyond our current capabilities to really probe and explore. And so the tools you're developing, I think, are going a long way towards building up those capabilities, but I think we also have a long way to go.
Yeah, and so much of that work relies on, as Chris said earlier, looking to people who have already done this work with human subjects, right? And have been researching these things for years, and then seeing how to transfer them over, how to operationalize them with respect to algorithms and things of the sort, yeah.
And so, Chris, we've talked a little bit about, you know, the nature of human identity and concepts like justice, for instance. So what are your thoughts on AI in the law relative to human notions of justice?
Well, I mean, so to try to tie this together, right? One of the central challenges, central questions that we're dealing with language models is how much, given that they're trained primarily on forms, they're trained on, you know, words in the thinnest sense, productions, just, you know, the text, pure text. How much information, how much content can be gleaned merely out of text, taken out of the social, historical, emotional, personal context in which those original utterances and sentences occurred. This is the fundamental question. We humans pull out a bunch of stuff. We pull out value, we pull out wisdom, we pull out notions of fairness from our experience with each other through speech and through other kinds of interactions. But we have the richness of this kind of multi-dimensional experience that we learn from and are taught, you know, we reproduce those in our classrooms, you know, and venues like this. So you know, in thinking about these things, you know, and this goes back to the original point that what these devices are performing in ways that are spectacular, that look on the surface to be very similar. If you just look at the production of sentences in the right moment at the right time, they seem very human, correct. But we don't know what's missing, and I mean. Well, we know what's missing in the sense that we know what they didn't have when they were learning to perform in the way that they did. So trying to find out how to balance these things, I think, is crucial for going at these questions, thinking about these things as we go forward.
Yeah, you know, one concrete example I heard recently is that some of these systems, you could give it a list of words and ask it to sort it into alphabetical order. And this is not something these systems were trained to do explicitly, but somehow it's able to do this. And this is one of the phenomena that the Microsoft team noted as being reasons why it thinks there might be some notion of intelligence within these systems. But if you asked it to sort the words in reverse alphabetical order, much worse, much worse. And so it's really unclear how to probe, you know, what exactly is relying on the superficial kind of text level versus what's really understood underneath. And I think you're exactly right. I know on sort of the other end of the spectrum, mathematicians are really interested in looking at whether these tools can come up with and prove new mathematical theorems. And the idea would be that if it were able to do that, then it would somehow be an indicator of it having some reasoning capability that goes beyond a totally superficial level. I don't think that's been achieved, but I know that the mathematics community is very interested in exploring that. So not only in terms of concepts like justice and understanding those, but understanding how to reason through kind of concrete logical, methodological arguments is also of interest in this space. So I think another question that we've probably all seen in the media many times is how afraid should we be of sentient AI? So panelists, what are your thoughts? Sharese, I can tell you want to start.
I don't know if I have anything profound to say, but I think we still have a long way to go. Personally, just from my own interaction with the technology, it appears as if, these are algorithms that are learning statistical generalizations. And if I don't know that human performance could be boiled down simply to that. And so I think we need a lot more work, right, to go beyond mimicry, right, and understanding what exactly we're witnessing when we see it behave in particular ways.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Mimicry is a fantastic way to describe it, right? Like I think under the hood, what these large language models are doing is they're saying, well, given the past set of words, what's the most likely, or what are some of the most likely next words? So if I say, hello, my name is Indigo Montoya, then many people would have a pretty good idea about what my next word might be. But it doesn't really mean that you understand, the context or why that's significant or where it comes from. And so it's learned somehow to parrot that phrase or that kind of text or produce something plausible without necessarily internalizing the way a human might internalize, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Heather, Chris, I don't know if you have additional thoughts?
I'm afraid of sentient humans, actually. Much more so, and in particular sentient humans who don't think hard enough about what they're doing and the consequences of what they might do. In particular, potentially with respect to the possibility of sentient machines. I would hope that if that ever happens, then we'll look back or we'll look forward, or back, I'm not sure if we'll be back or forward, and say, boy, it's a good thing we treated these things the way that we did, and not, oh, it's a real bummer that we didn't, because we read that novel, it was written by Mary Shelley, and it didn't turn out well. So, another important thing to keep in mind.
Yeah, just only on top of that, I think misuse of the current technology is very important because they already directly generate harm. That's all the harms we see today. And that harm is not going away. And the more we're coming. And so I think it's important to think about how do we actually deal with those. And that will take years. It will take regulation many years to actually make that happen. The EU AI law, AI Act, it was drafted last year and it will only be put in effect next year. Mm-hmm. So it's time to actually start these work to deal with the current harm and also think about what's the long-term trajectory. I think you have to combine everything in a single pass.
Yeah. I mean, I think maybe we're being a little too negative here because there are things to be concerned about, right? And I think people at universities really should be thinking about these hard questions. But as we started with, there are a lot of positives, right? Armin talked about John Jumper and his work in trying to understand protein folding using AI. The latest state-of-the-art weather prediction model is an AI model. And it's making a lot of kind of humdrum tasks much easier for many people, and then potentially freeing them up to do much more interesting, creative, and innovative things. And so I guess the real challenge is figuring out how to enable all of those really exciting and transformative advances while making sure that people in general and vulnerable people in particular are protected.
I just want to comment that there are a lot of work in AI fields that are being very using ethical methods to achieve advances. The work that Becca just mentioned, including her work on AI on science, all are these categories. In many of these categories, randomization is actually pretty good. A randomization mapping of different space is actually can be achieved by AI model. They can actually help us find the trajectory, right? So these are very, very exciting field for AI, but they're not in the same Gen AI field that the hype that we see today. I just don't want people to actually put them into the same category. There are a lot of amazing opportunity in that category as well.
Yeah, it seems like what's important is for us as human beings to prioritize what do we need, right? What are our needs and how do we thoughtfully go about, right? Creating technology that supports them. But I mean, also it's hard to probably get human beings to agree on what our needs are. But that said, I think it starts with us first, right? And making important decisions and thinking about how certain groups may be disproportionately affected, how certain groups are able to interact with the technology versus others, equity, those kinds of things, yeah, are important.
Can I say something?
Please, yes.
So I think at one point they asked, I thought we would suggest we begin by answering questions like, what does it mean to be human? So I was trying to think of like, what's the answer to that question? I think, one answer to that question, what does it mean to be human, is asking the question, what does it mean to be human, right? Not many things would do that. And actually, one of the really cool things about language models, I think, is that they're really pushing us hard on that question. Pushing in ways that feel uncomfortable. Everybody's saying, well, they're just parrots, blah, blah, blah. We should be open to the possibility that we're just parrots. I don't believe that. But it would be unscientific to not consider that possibility. I think it's important, you laugh, but it's true. Actually, there's the language models in particular, for the case I know best about language, are really pushing us to rethink some stuff that we took for granted for the last 60 to 70 years about the way human language works and how it's special. I think that we'll still find out that it's special, but this technology is disrupting the way that we've thought about things, and that is a good University of Chicago thing to do for sure.
So I'd like to hand it over to you guys to see if you have questions. Yeah, thank you for raising your hands. So there's a few people with microphones around who are going to walk around and hand over the microphones.
Hi, my name is Nicole McKnight. I'm class of 2002, biology, college. One quick question and then one regular question. Have you been using any of the nifty tools to, in real time, record this talk? And then if yes, can we have a copy of it? And second question is actually off the back of that parroting, idea around language. So I'm a biologist, like I said. Birds, for instance, have amazing, very sophisticated language. How are you looking back at biology and not just Homo sapiens, right? How are you looking at biology in general to feed your research?
Excellent. So for the recording, Christine, do you know?
No. It's so easy. You just set up a computer there and you would have recorded everything.
Take notes.
Can I say something brief about that? I'm not doing any of that. But another one of the cool things about language was, for a long time, I think we felt we couldn't ask much about other species and what kind of linguistic capacities they have, because it's just really too hard to tell. It's hard to know where there might be signal with properties that are similar to human languages. Language models may give us the capacity to do that. So one of the things people are doing that I think is super interesting is looking at cetacean productions, whales, and other creatures. And just the capacity to maybe find what might be systematic in that signal that a human couldn't just do by sitting there and staring at it is super interesting. That's an really open, interesting area.
Super interesting.
Hi, yeah, I wanted to follow up on I guess Professor Kennedy's comment that maybe one day we'll find what is special about human language. I mean, do you have any ideas for, like, I guess, what the leading candidates for what might be special about human language would be?
You mean what it is now, what I think it is now?
Yeah.
The capacity to represent any kind of thought or feeling that we want using a finite amount of vocabulary, and you understand me when I'm doing it if you speak the same language as me. But we already knew that. I mean, that's just like descriptive. That's a feature of human language, that we can basically turn into a representation that any member of our speech community can basically get content from anything that we can think, more or less. That's pretty cool.
Thank you so much for the talk. I feel like the discussion is a bit tilted towards language models, and I was curious, like, how do you think about, for example, AlphaFold, and there was just awarded the Nobel Prize in Chemistry, and AI beating Go champions, and even like going back 30 years ago, Deep Blue beating chess masters. Like, I feel like there's a lot that AI can do, and is that actually saying something that humans are not as good as machines, or? But after all, it's humans putting together the algorithms, right? So how do we think about that beyond language models? Thanks again.
So again, that's a fantastic question, and I think we have focused on generative AI and large language models in particular because it was the theme of the evening. But you're absolutely right that things like AlphaFold or the chess systems are really phenomenal, and things that were just beyond imagination only a short while ago. And they've got an enormous amount of potential. AlphaFold is really transforming the way people are approaching drug discovery, for instance. And the way we approach weather forecasts is going to be, I think, transformative for all kinds of people in agriculture worldwide who didn't have access to good forecasts in the past, and it affected their abilities to grow good crops. I think the chess is one particularly interesting example, in part because with chess, it's an area where we've tried to explore whether the chess models, the AI models that play chess, really understand something that humans do not, or whether they just have much bigger memory than our poor human brains, right? And so people have been trying to design tests and probe that. I was talking with someone recently from DeepMind, and they were working with a set of different chess masters, and they were having the chess masters essentially like be tutored in chess by some of these systems, and evaluating to what extent what they were getting out of the tutorials was novel and a new perspective to them. And at least in initial studies, it seemed like yes. So that goes a little bit more to this question of, to what extent are these AI systems capturing things beyond human knowledge, as opposed to just being able to churn through huge amounts of data in a way that our brains are not really designed for. But in all of these systems, right, the kind of common theme is that there's just a ton of data, right? So when people start talking about developing similar systems in totally new settings, often the major initial barrier is collecting good data. And even when we talk about some of the biases that you've been studying, Sharese, the issue is that even though we've got a ton of language data, it's not necessarily representative.
Right.
And so we still, despite having trillions and trillions of words that we're training on, still don't have enough data in some senses.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. It's that we don't have enough data that's representative of particular populations. And it's also that sort of the way that we try to get rid of it, the kinds of current solutions we have, which is human feedback training as well as larger data sets, don't fix it as well. So like, we don't genuinely have a solution, which speaks to your point about this will take years for us to really deal with, yeah.
Right. Oh, okay, I'm being told this is our last question, but we'll be around at the reception afterwards as well.
Thanks. in the financial industry, one of the use applications that they've been working on is sentiment analysis. And this directly relates to what you've been talking about. Just briefly for the people who don't know about this, what they're trying to do is say in a stockholder meeting, the CEO gives remarks or makes a speech about the company. They're trying to analyze that to see whether it's positive or negative, to try and predict whether the stock price would go up or go down. And one of the simple techniques that they're doing is they look for particular words that might indicate positivity or negativity, and they assign some kind of a score to the word. And that is how they, and then overall, when the speech is finished, they sort of balance that out and see, whether there are more positives than negatives to try and... Anyway, the question is whether any of you have been involved in this, because there is huge money that they are putting, these financial companies, they don't play games. And it's quite an important usage case in terms of how everything you're talking about is actually being applied. Whether it's ethical or not, I don't know, but they're doing it because they think they can make money off it.
I actually did a user study on this, or a measurement study a few years ago. This is falling to the classical or predictive AI. You can actually use this to look at the word weights. But there's a caveat to that is I work in secure privacy, so there's always a way to kind of bypass or fool the AI system. I can change some of the words, they mean the same thing to a human, but the machine will tell them in the negative, it will trigger the flip of the sentiment. So there's always a way for people to inject either perturbation or flip the words or anything to actually change the sentiment or the outcome of the AI prediction. So those things happen. So in that case, there is going to be a lot of effort in developing the SSI model to actually deal with some of these kind of perturbation or adversarial kind of intent to actually change the model predictive output. So there are a lot of work in this domain from many different fields, and it's a lot of companies are actually imposing these kind of, we call this adversarial training or whatever, trying to actually prevent or make the AI model less sensitive to this kind of subtle changes in the data.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I also know that some of our colleagues in the Booth School are thinking about ways to use different AI tools in the context of finance, not necessarily sentiment analysis, but other sorts of challenges in that space. So there's definitely activity at UChicago in that space. Thank you all so much for your questions.
It's my job first to thank you, Professor Willett, for moderating such a fantastic conversation. I'll ask you all to join me again in thanking the panel for an amazing conversation. I also want to thank all of you for listening, for the insightful questions. For those of you who have not had the opportunity to meet, I am Lauren Henry. I'm the Executive Director of the Alumni Team at the University of Chicago and also a very proud alum of the college. And I usually say I'm proud to be a member of this community like every single day, right? Whether I've been watching over the past week in Hyde Park, the students hunker down, it's reading period, so it's kind of getting quieter, whether it's being in New York for 2 days, running around in the rain, meeting with all of these incredible alumni, or just walking my dog on campus, but it really is evenings like these when we come together to talk about the research that's happening at the university, the thought leadership that's happening at the university, that are really the moments that I am the most proud, and I hope that you all feel the same and that you carry it with you from this evening and just continue to engage, whether that's coming to more events, whether that's going to work tomorrow and talking about the cool stuff you learned, right? Whether that's providing philanthropic support for our students and our alumni and our faculty, whatever it is, I hope that you'll remain connected with us. I am supposed to ask for a special favor, which is that we're currently in the interest of gathering data, doing a study of kind of what alumni and friends, what's on your mind, what you want us to know, what you want to see, more exciting stuff like this. So you should have an email in your inbox from Armin. Please take that. And I'll just say one last thing. Another thing that makes me really proud of this community is the amazing team that I have the privilege of leading. So I want to ask you all to join me in thanking them for all of their work. But not happen without them. So add thanks to them. And then I think I am the only thing between you all and dessert and more conversation. So I'm going to release you with another, thank you so much. It means so much to us that you come out on meetings like this.